Hi, it's Marla from Narrate. In this week's message, Adam begins by asking, is all comparison bad? If it's not all bad, when do we know if we're caught in a comparison trap? Enjoy as we begin week 1 of the Comparison Trap series.
So I just want to say anecdotally, I think in many ways, Brian and his wife Lindsay and their family kind of embody the ways to connect around here, and recognizing that it's the fall and probably many of you are new to this culture. Listen, part of what we embrace is the reality that not everybody who comes to church on Sunday is looking for relationships. In fact, some of you, you want to be the last ones in the door and the first ones out, and we fully respect that. Many of us have been on the receiving end of cultures where it was okay to hide for a couple years and just process Jesus for extended time. And so we've worked hard to create that culture. And though we had nothing to do with building the balcony, we recognize even that can help with that culture. But that means that for those of you who do want to connect and you are looking for relationships, it brings about a different kind of challenge. Because what we've purposely done is created an organization that underfunctions because we don't want to overpromise on what it takes to have relationship. And I think to that end, when you get to the place where you want to get connected, Brian and Lindsay kind of embody that. As you can pick up from there, he and his wife, his family moved here from the Denver area a couple years ago, maybe a few years ago now. They started showing up at Narrate. And they just started stepping forward. That's a Kate phrase uses that I think captures it well. They just started scattering with us and serving with us on Sundays and getting on teams and slowly but surely meeting people that they shared interests with and having people over to their home and receiving invitations to go to their home. And a few years later, they're connected. So just want to level with you. If you're looking to connect it around here, we think there's lots of opportunity. We also think it could take you a year or more to really get to the place where you feel like that's happening for you. And if you're not looking to get connected, that's okay too. It's just kind of all part of this thing called being a church in a community together. So this morning what we're going to do is we're going to start this conversation called Comparison Trap. And by way of a little bit of background, part of last week we talked about the day leads to the dream and the 20-mile march and what are the things you need to do every day to make the big dreams happen. Well, for me, part of that is listening to podcasts. Comparison Trap is actually a series that Andy Stanley did several years ago. He leads a church in Alpharetta, Georgia, one of the best churches and the biggest, I think it's the second biggest church in the country. And part of what I do every day is listen to a podcast because my spiritual gift is plagiarism. I try to follow Jesus. I recognize that I'm a content creator and I communicate 40 times a year, and it's not a good thing if I run out of ideas. So I'm just constantly listening to things, not always sermons. In fact, I would prefer not to listen to sermons, but I'm always listening to something. Hannah, is that back door out there open? I'm wondering if, in fact, the front door is open. Sorry. So as I was listening to different messages several years ago when Andy Stanley did this series, I listened to this series called Comparison Trap and kind of went like, oh, that whatever, and I just kind of filed it away like I always do. And then this spring, some things happened that made me pick it back up. And so I just want to give context as to why we're shamelessly plagiarizing a whole series. What happened to me was as baseball season got started, I'm not going to talk a lot about baseball, I promise, but as a parent and as an assistant coach, because I always just assistant coach, I don't like the head coach, I'm not a good head coach, plus I like to make lots of decisions in work, and so I just like to be the right-hand person to somebody who does like to make lots of decisions. And so I think of myself as the kind kids friend guy on the team. And as the season was happening, I watched something happening, and I kind of was aware of it, and then you just kind of push it down. And then I feel like God brought it up in my own chair, kind of get up early, drink something hot, read the Bible, pray a little bit kind of time. And what I was observing was that my ability to watch my boys play baseball was enjoyable to the degree, not that just that they succeeded, but that they succeeded relative to other kids on the teams. Now, I know you're never supposed to admit this stuff, and you guys are going, you're a horrible person. I am a horrible person, and you maybe you don't deal with this. But what I caught myself doing was watching certain players strike out, and you'd be like, yes. But externally you go, yeah, no, that's too bad. Sorry about that. That's a bad thing. And I caught myself the more I realized that it wasn't just like if one of my kids went 2 for 3 with a couple singles. It was, what did the other kids do? And especially in a world of all-stars and travel sports, it got very, very complicated. And I knew it was gross, and I was trying to kind of deal with it while coaching first base. And then one morning, I was just kind of processing chair time stuff, and I feel like God brought it up and went like, that's not just gross, that's disgusting. And then a friend of mine referenced a message from a women's conference, which you never know what to do when someone hands you a message from a women's conference, right? as a dude, like, okay. But anyway, it happened to be kind of the summary of this series. So I picked this series back up and went like, wait a minute, I think he's speaking to the very thing that I'm processing here, this comparison thing, which is really, really disgusting. And so I began to work through it. The other thing that happened simultaneously was there's a theologian named Walt Brueggemann. I became familiar with him through some guys at George Fox last year. He's one of the real respected theologians writing right now. He doesn't write a lot of like New York Times type stuff, but stuff that I mostly can't understand, but try to work my way through. He wrote a book called Money and Possessions. And I, for whatever reason, grabbed that book. I was fascinated by his unique take on those very real issues. And I have not made my way all the way through it. I don't understand 90% of what I have read, but his thesis I think, grasped. His thesis, and again, all this was happening this last spring as I was processing comparison and the grossness of that. His thesis is that perhaps the most fundamental, most vexing, broken part of the human heart is this issue of coveting. And in fact, what he points out as a scholar is that in the text, from very early, from as early as Adam and Eve, what you see is this very strong thread of coveting, and that coveting is what makes human relationship with one another and God and creation really become pretty broken. He points it out that it's present in Adam and Eve, Abel and Cain, of course. There's a coveting issue. And then he gets to the Ten Commandments. And you may remember, maybe you've at least seen them plastered on the side of a church somewhere, that when God gives the 10 Commandments to Moses, the 10th one deals directly with coveting. In Exodus 20, he says this, "And you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." See, the rabbis used to say that if you can obey the 10th command, you'll obey the other 9. And what he points out is Jesus comes along and goes, listen, the whole thing is about loving God and loving people, and the 10th command is very uniquely tied to our ability or inability to love people. The neighbor is a very strong theme of that. So, this whole idea of comparison became an interest for mine. And as I looked ahead to the fall, and I realized that for many of you, fall is a season where you kind of re-engage, spent more money than you made this summer, and it's time to get serious about business again, and it's time to get serious about school, and it's time to get dialed in. I just thought maybe it'd be healthy to kind of slow down and make sure that what's motivating us is not this comparison thing. But the more I've thought about it, in fact, I had my own crisis in my office this week because I'd committed to a series that I was really excited about, and then as I started working through it again to put my notes together, I realized I didn't really believe what I was going to say, which is a problem. Because one of the notions is, that Andy Stanley says, and with all due respect to him, is that there's no win in comparison. And the more I processed that again this week, I was like, wait a minute, I'm not even sure that I believe that. Because as dangerous as comparison is, I think we also have to admit that it is at times a very healthy, helpful thing. How do we learn? How do you grow in your sector? Whether you're an artist or a student or an athlete, how do you get better at things? Like, I would like to think that I'm all the better for the time I spend listening to Andy Stanley and other communicators do what they do. And in most cases, do it far better than the way I do it. And that process of comparison, it makes me a better teacher, right? One of my favorite books is a book called Steal Like an Artist. And there, this artist just confesses that one thing artists don't always admit is that all art is an iteration of something else, that they steal. I would venture to say that in your sector, whether you sell things or teach people things, whether you're a student or an athlete or you're a musician, part of the process is comparing what you do to how others do it and growing in that direction. Right? Like, I think I'm better for listening to that and listening to other podcasts. In fact, I think this even comes up in relationship. Isn't part of the value of things like dating, it's a comparison thing. If you were to go to my friend Fred, who is the most credible marriage relationship guy I know on the planet, met with over 20,000 people, he's just got this vast experience. If you were to go to him and say, I'm thinking about marrying this girl, or I'm thinking about marrying this guy, you know what question he would follow that with? Now, there's always exceptions to this. I don't want to create any marriage crises because some of you are the exception to this, but nonetheless, you know what question he would ask you? He would ask, have you dated enough to know she's the one? Have you dated enough to know he's the one? Which is a function of comparison. I know that because he asked me that very question when I was 20 years old. And it's a little counterintuitive in Christian subculture. And yet he's acknowledging that oftentimes what the 17-year-old heartbroken student doesn't know when they lose their first girlfriend or boyfriend is listen. Part of this whole process is comparison. Now, again, there's always exceptions. I think I followed Jesus because of comparison. I grew up in a culture where I knew to believe in Jesus, kind of like Brian was alluding to. But I didn't necessarily grow up in a culture where I knew how to follow Jesus. And at 17 years old, when I started hanging out with a family who followed Jesus in some pretty approachable, non-religious, very kind of non-judgy ways, after sitting in that culture with them for a couple years, it was very simple for me. I just went like, I see what you have, and I see what I have. I see what your clan has. I see what my clan has, and I want that, which is in a very real sense was a function of comparison. And so really the question that I want to ask this morning is, how then do we differentiate between a comparison that's functional and helpful and a comparison that is a trap? Listen, if you're in a sector and you're going like, I'm not going to pay attention to what any other banks do because we just do it right and perfect, chances are you're not going to exist very long. So how do we tell the difference between a comparison that is healthy and one that has us ensnared by all kinds of coveting, kind of envy issues? Well, I think one place to look, we could ask it this way. Go to that next slide. How do we know when we're trapped by comparison? And one place to look at this is in the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, if you're not familiar with the book of Ecclesiastes, or you're going like, I'm not a Bible person, Ecclesiastes would be a great place to start. Because the great thing about Ecclesiastes is it's super approachable. It's in the Old Testament. There are no miracles. It's written before Jesus was born. And so, in fact, if you were to read the book of Ecclesiastes, if you've been thinking maybe about reading the Bible for the first time in some morning, then if you were to start here, here's what would happen. You'd go, Wait a minute, that's in a song. Wait a minute, I think Simon and Garfunkel stole that. Because it's this very approachable text. It's written by a guy named Solomon. And Solomon, just by the way of context, he was the third king of Israel. He was incredibly affluent. Some would say the richest person in that part of the world in his day. He was incredibly respected for his wisdom. In fact, kings and queens from other nations would come and sit at his feet and ask him questions, and I'm assuming for a loan. He was this incredibly intelligent, experienced person, and at some point, assuming towards the latter part of his life, he started reflecting on the way he approached things, and really that's where this book Ecclesiastes is born. And in chapter 4, I just want to pick up, he says this, and I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. And so he starts by making this observation that left to itself, human nature is motivated purely by the desire to be better than other people. That left to itself, we're not motivated to improve for improving's sake. We're not motivated to improve for the sake of serving people better. But what we do is we look over our shoulder and we go, am I okay? Yep, compared to him I am. Am I okay? Compared to him, I'm not. And what he's observing is that if we're not careful, if we don't examine it, what drives us in life, relationship, business, everything else is this simple desire to outcompete other people. And you ask him, so what do you think about that, Solomon? And watch this. He says, this too is meaningless. A chasing after the wind. Now, we don't use that idiom anymore. We do something with the wind in an idiom, but it wouldn't be appropriate to talk about from the stage. But chasing after the wind, it's a waste of, it's like saying, hey, Solomon, how do you feel about this whole idea of constantly comparing yourself to others and finding your motivation by doing that? He would say, it's like a chasing after the wind. And you might go, I don't get it, because you can't catch the wind. And he would go, exactly. That's the danger. That if your point is comparing yourself to others, if you're going to be more creative, more pretty, more successful, whatever, more athletic, a better whatever, the problem is there's no finish line. There's no success. There's no solace. There's no tranquility. That there's no defined win. It's like maybe you grew up with a dad saying, if you're going to define yourself by being the toughest kid in school, get ready, because there's always a tougher kid, right? Which turns out I didn't have the problem of trying to define myself as being the toughest kid in school. But that's what he's saying is be careful. Because you can't, if the only thing that motivates you is being better, then you'll never catch it. For me, it helps to think of a guy like Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers, some of the best, NFL players. And it's easy to watch Tom Brady and go, he must have the satisfaction of knowing that he's the best ever. Does he? Or is he too, if defined by comparing himself to Aaron Rodgers, chasing the wind? He keeps going. So, because here's part of the problem is we go, okay, so now what we're talking about is don't be motivated. Just sit on your couch and wait for God to answer your prayers. And quite frankly, that's not really the culture here. We're a type A kind of driven culture. We're not ones to sit around. If anything, we're guilty of acting before God versus waiting for God to just do it for us. What are you talking about? Just be lazy, Solomon? Remember, he's the wisest person ever. And watch this. Fools fold their hands and ruin themselves. So he's not saying don't be motivated. It's like Solomon's going, don't think I'm not saying don't be motivated. Do you know who I am? Have you seen my gardens? Have you seen the temple? Have you heard of my wisdom? Did you know I had 300 wives and 600 concubines? I'm a busy dude. I've got a lot going on. Don't think this isn't about maximizing potential, about getting better, about growing and improving. He's allowing that. And what he says next, and this to me is the cincher in this whole conversation. I think this might be worth writing on a Post-it note and put it on your mirror. It might be worth writing on your steering wheel. It might be taking a screenshot from Bible Gateway or something and making it the home screen on your phone, because what he says next, and part of what I love about this is it takes away the morality of standard of living, of how much we make, of how much success. It gets rid of the judgy component. What he's allowing is this is relative. My friend Fred used to always say, if you want more money, then stop talking about people who do and go get it. And if you're happy with what you have, then just be happy with what you have and shut up about people who have more. It's kind of the position he's coming at this from. This is not a black and white. Okay, so how motivated can I be? How big can I make the business? It's not that black and white, but listen to what he says. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. See, here's what he's saying here. I have a hard time reading poetry, so I'm just going to assume that the aha doesn't happen immediately for you either. But what he's saying is it's better to have what you can hold in one hand and be satisfied with what you have than to have both hands full and have that anxiety of like, how do I get more? How do I get more? And doing this and have no tranquility. Saying, listen, in this whole scheme of motivation and getting better and growing, it's far better to only have one handful, but to be holding it loosely and to actually be enjoying it than to have grasped and filled two hands and be full of angst and frustration. Better to live like this, he's saying, than with these two clenched fists. And he keeps going. Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun, which is part of the irony of Ecclesiastes, because for those of you who are critics by nature and you love deconstructionism, Ecclesiastes is your guy. It's your book. Because he's just constantly just tearing things to shred and looking back and going, what is the point? Maybe like you do when you mourn death or something like that. Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. And then he goes on. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil. Yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. Now, contextually, of course, what we know here is that you couldn't leave an inheritance to women in this day. So the fact that he had no son, no brother, says this guy is just work. Just how can I get more, out-compete, beat them. It kind of reminds me of like when you're on a road trip on a two-lane road. You know that sensation, and you're 40 miles in, and you know you've passed 3 semi-trucks, and all of a sudden someone's like, hey, can we stop for the bathroom? And you're like, no. Because then I've got to repass those semis again, right? Like that's the emotional reality of what he's talking about here. This guy he's just passing people, and yet what he can constantly see is the next person he's got to pass. And then all of a sudden, and this is my prayer for this series, the reason why I'm doing it in the fall is because I just think that we buckle down and we get serious in unique ways. This is what I'm hoping, is that this kind of self-awareness would come from all of us. Because listen to what he asks. For whom am I toiling? Why am I working so hard? See, it makes hard work, it's not black and white. I mean, hard work is you should do it. But how big the business should be, how many meetings, how many hours, all of that stuff. He goes, no, it's for whom am I working? It reminds me, years ago, Rob Bell said something. He said, before we do anything, we should ask ourselves, is this coming out of who I am, or am I trying to earn something? Why am I working so hard? Doing some reading for class this week and read this, and those of you in leadership roles maybe will, well, go ahead to that next slide. He says, without the regular experience of being received and loved by God in solitude and silence, we're vulnerable to a kind of leadership that is driven by profound emptiness that we are seeking to fill through performance and achievement. Why are we trying to outcompete them? Is it to serve God and people? Or is it so that you can look in the mirror and please somebody who maybe has even been dead for decades at this point? He keeps going. Next slide. And why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? Why am I so busy and yet so unsatisfied? Why am I so successful and yet so empty? And then Solomon says this too is meaningless, a miserable business. If nothing else, what he's doing is sharing with you that if you have the fortune to die with a healthy state of mind, these are the types of questions that you'll probably be asking yourself. Why did I work so hard? Did I prioritize the right thing? Did I actually stop and enjoy things? So here's what I'm hoping that we can do is, can you imagine what would happen if we began to live in a rhythm where we could catch ourselves before we run off to the next meeting, not even saying running off to the next meeting is a bad thing, before we make the next commitment, before we buy the next thing? Could you imagine what would happen if we just went like, okay, am I chasing the wind? Am I living in this place where I'm satisfied with what I can hold in one hand? Or is this just another instance of me filling two hands and still not being satisfied? It's very gray, isn't it? Remember, the question is, how do we know if we're trapped by comparison? And here's a few questions that I think may be helpful. Number one, are you tired? Now, you could be tired for lots of reasons. We all know that. But if your game is constantly passing the next person, if what drives you is being better than them, if what drives you is pleasing some person that's been gone for a long time, or maybe you still work with whatever, it's an exhausting existence. Are you tired? Or how about this one? Go ahead. Are you broke? Again, you can be broke for lots of reasons. But if you're caught up where every time you see something that someone else has, you have to have it, that'll lead to being broke. You know, if you're in this place where you don't have enough and therefore you justify the debt, then that'll lead to being broke. To me, one of the healthy gauges is if the version of you 10 years ago knew how much money you made, how much money you make, and that you feel stressed about finances, what would that version say to you? Would they call you a poser? You know, if college self knew what kind of money you make today and how stressed out you are, and therefore you justify saying, I have to live on 110% or 100% and I can't save anything and I definitely can't give anything, might that be a sign that you're motivated by a competition that doesn't matter? One of the things that I try to repeat to myself, and sometimes my boys often, is a statement I heard from Richard Foster years ago. He said, a mark of spiritual maturity is the ability to enjoy something without having to own it. I think this is what makes being a student in middle school or high school so difficult. Because you go to someone's house and you experience what they have, and then you got to have it, right? And yet we do this as adults. We can't just enjoy a day at somebody else's cabin. The minute we experience that they had we've got to have our own. Can you enjoy something without having to own one? Or how about this? Are you allowing what other people have to keep you from enjoying what you have? You know, to go to someone's house and you experience, and they have got 10-foot ceilings, and then you walk into your house and you feel like you have to duck because they're only 9 feet tall. You know that thing? Like, are you so caught up comparing yourself to what other people have that you're looking past the great things you have? Or do you enjoy your kids? Or are you just constantly riding them to get better? You know, quite frankly, we live in a culture that has a very narrow definition of what it means to be a successful 13 or 17-year-old, don't we? Are you enjoying them? Or do you play this secret game where your kids have to be better than their kids? And you would never admit that, maybe even to yourself, but it definitely pushes you. Or how about this one? Who would you secretly enjoy seeing fail? I didn't mean to meddle, but I just want to ask the question. Because this thing happens. Someone tells us something happened, and we, on the phone, we're like, oh, that's such a bummer. And internally we're going, yes, their perfect business finally has a flaw. Their perfect kids finally made a mistake. Isn't that like the most gross aspect of human nature? Right? That we enjoy seeing. I think this is what drives our celebrity culture. We love to see magazines and hear stories, whether they're athletes or actors and actresses, whatever, of people who have failed. Why? Because somehow we feel vindicated by that. I love it when I see a typo on a Wheaties box, because somehow it just makes me feel better about myself and the things that we work so hard at. Who would you secretly enjoy seeing fail? You know, I wonder, and it's nothing new, but I wonder if one of the real tests of this, am I caught in a comparison trap, if it comes back to gratitude. Something we've talked about often. Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5 says, rejoice always. Go to that next slide. Pray continually. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus, which warns that God's will isn't circumstantial. It flows out of gratitude and emotion. I wonder if, right, it's one thing to upgrade, to grow, to expand, to scale, to purchase, to compete out of a heart of gratitude. And it's another thing to do that out of an empty heart that's actually trying to feel loved. There's a book called How to Be Miserable. I've referenced it often. It's written by a therapist from Canada who gives 40 things to do to make your life stink. You know what the last chapter is? The last chapter says, anytime you go to read a book, make sure it's non-fiction self-help. Anytime you're trying to figure out what to listen to for your next podcast, make sure it's about personal growth. Never, he says, reflect upon the growth that has occurred. Never pay attention to who you are. Always pay attention to who you aren't. Don't ever read fiction, he says. Always focus on what's the next thing you're going to fix about yourself. Isn't that the heart of the gospel? That God's primary disposition towards us is unconditional love? That the Christian experience isn't earning God's love, but coming to peace with the fact that we are unconditionally loved and finding our motivation to grow as a motivation to serve him. It's a gratitude motivation, not an earn it motivation. I read this week about a play called Our Town. I was kind of bummed because as soon as I started reading about it, I was like, wait a minute, I think Grand Street did it last fall. And sure enough, they did, or last year. But the storyline of Our Town, I'm not an expert on, but there's a particular scene where this girl who has died is begging the stage manager, who has this kind of almost divine-like role within the play. She's begging the stage manager to come back to life and experience one day of her life. And he's reluctant, but she's persistent. And eventually the stage manager gives this girl permission to come back, and she decides that she's going to relive her 12th birthday. And at her 12th birthday, what she begins to observe is the superficial relational existence of humans. That they see each other, but they don't ever look at each other. And there's a poignant scene where she's begging her mom to just see her, to just look at her, to be present to her. And her mom can't and won't do it. And eventually she becomes very frustrated and sad. And she asks to go back to the grave, that she's better to be in the grave than to continue to live in this perpetuating non-existence where we're always focused on everything but people. And she says to the stage manager before she goes back, is this how people live? Do they ever actually see one another? And he says, no. Every once in a while the poets, but otherwise no. What if Solomon, some thousands of years ago, was one of those poets who looked back and went, wait a minute. Working hard, progressing, positive things, of course they are. But getting overly caught up to the point where we have two hands full and we wish we had a third, but we enjoy none of it, a waste of time. But having what you can hold in one hand and being satisfied, that's a life well lived. So would you this week, would you be willing to ask some questions of the people you're living life with? Maybe being so vulnerable as to go in, can you see areas in my life where I'm caught up in a comparison trap? Maybe even being vulnerable enough to come before God. Maybe you've never done that before. You don't ever have to tell anybody if you're still thinking it's weird. But to download the Bible to your phone and put it on airplane mode and wake up in the morning 10 minutes earlier and spend 5 minutes maybe reading Ecclesiastes 4 and 5 minutes going, okay, Lord, I don't even know if you're real, but if you are, talk to me. Would you be willing to go before God and just start asking, wait a minute, am I tired because I'm in a trap? Am I broke because I'm in a trap? Am I at odds with my kids because I'm in a trap? Is there this emotional dishonesty in my existence because I'm always satisfied when I'm beating others and dissatisfied when they're beating me? Would you be willing to come before God and begin to allow him to kind of subjectively work you through a type of motivation that honors him and a type that ultimately is full of regrets? I'd like to pray. God, thanks, Lord, for guys like Solomon and the poets and the fact that we stand on the shoulders of people who sit on the shoulders of people, and it's so easy to miss that the cycle of life that we're in, guys like Solomon were in, and we have the privilege of looking back at some observations many of us think recorded and inspired by you that challenge us to think about things like coveting and envy and our motivation. God, we want to honor you by being good at what we do, by working hard, by growing and expanding in all kinds of ways, and yet we want the kinds of relationships that come from a healthy motivation. We love you, Jesus. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.